This is going to be a kind of just an overview of our program, but then also some of the main objectives that we have, and then what we've been focused on in the recent years. We're funded in 5-year periods, which I'll go over a little bit. But if you have any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to ask. It's nice having a small crowd like this. Okay, so I have a question for all of you though. How many of you were here when the oil spill happened? Wow, okay, about half, roughly. And initially, after the oil spill, there was really, those of you that were here know, there was a lot of chaos, as there always is with these situations, but in particular with this one. And from a science biology perspective, one of the primary questions that was emerging is, what is the impact of the spill? And what's the potential recovery for those resources that were impacted? But part of the complication was that some of these species, taxa groups, were already maybe declining or showing different trends prior to this spill. So what was the additive effect of the spill? So not too long after the spill, within about 5-6 years, the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council started these integrated studies. So here's an example of the first few. The Sound Ecosystem Assessment that looked at pink salmon and Pacific herring in Prince William Sound. The Alaska Predator Ecosystem Experiment, which was swordfish and seabirds in Prince William Sound, Gulf of Alaska, and Cook Inlet. And the Nearshore Predator Project, we looked at impacts to the nearshore ecosystem. And so I wasn't here when the spill occurred, but I remember my wife and I had just finished our undergraduate degree. We were working on a bird study in Sierra Mountains, and I remember listening on the radio to the events unfolding, and how devastating it was, and thinking about us, not only communities, but also us from a biology perspective. But I would have never guessed that 6 years later, I would be working on one of the post-oil spill studies. So I was part of the Alaska Predator Ecosystem Experiment, early on doing seabird forage studies in Prince William Sound between 1995 and 2001. And then after that, the project ended. I ended up going down to Oregon State University, and I worked down there on a variety of projects for about 15, 16 years. And then I found myself in 2016 back up in Alaska, and actually, again, working with the Gulf Watch Alaska program, which I'm going to introduce to you, and some of you are probably very familiar with it. So there's those initial integrated studies. There's, of course, because of the fisheries associated with it and the important ecosystem component, there was a large focus on herring research. So initially, there was the integrated herring restoration program, which then eventually became part of the herring research monitoring program, which is now was separate from Gulf Watch Alaska, but now it's integrated into Gulf Watch Alaska. And so Gulf Watch Alaska was started in 2012 with the idea of being a 20-year program. And we're currently in our 18th year of that program. And I joined it when it was in year 6. The overall goal was to provide sound scientific data and products that inform management agencies and the public about the oil spill affected regions. And again, like some of those earlier studies, taking an integrated ecosystem approach and then also doing science synthesis. So we're going to be meeting at our annual PI meeting over the next couple of days, discussing the results that we have observed over the past year, and then also focusing on how to synthesize data to better understand what is occurring. And Gulf Watch Alaska is broken into these 3 major components: environmental drivers, biological physical oceanography, the nearshore ecosystem that was heavily impacted by the spill, and then also the pelagic ecosystem, so the forage fish, seabirds, marine mammals, for example. This is what the footprint looks like. So it's primarily focused between Lower Cook Inlet and the Copper River Delta. And we have the environmental drivers of biological physical oceanography includes that whole range. The pelagic component also includes earlier with Lower Cook Inlet. We still have some sampling there, but not as much as we used to. But also Prince William Sound and some locations in between. And then also Middleton Island. And those tracks that you see leaving Middleton Island, those are all seabird foraging tracks. And part of that is a long-term monitoring project out there of seabird reproductive success and diets. And one thing that was most interesting in Gulf Watch Alaska is using the diets of the seabirds as an indicator of forage species. And I often like to think of seabirds as the original drones for marine studies, because we sit back at the colony and they bring samples of fish back to us. But then we're also partnering with some other studies in the Gulf of Alaska, and in this region in particular, it's the National Science Foundation funded Northern Gulf of Alaska long-term ecological research. And so with that is more heavily oceanography focused, lower trophic levels, but does include seabird observations. And they expand our footprint in leveraging some of the Exxon Valdez oil spill funded research that we're doing. So that includes, that the Seward line with the GAC1 and the geomooring identified there. So GAC1 is a part of Gulf Watch Alaska. That Seward line sampling is part of Gulf Watch Alaska. But that geomooring is with the LTER funding, and then also it adds the additional oceanographic sampling lines, which are really important for comparison over Albatross Bank off of Kodiak, and then also to the east or near Kayak Island, and then also across from the Copper River Delta out to Middleton Island. Okay, so thinking about ecosystem change, perturbations, etc. They can be broadly classified into a few different patterns. And this is by far the reason why these integrated longer-term studies to understand recovery potential of injured resources is so critical. So we have these cyclical patterns, which you all observe with the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So El Nino, La Nina, we're kind of moving into a La Nina period, which is at least projected to continue through the winter and early spring. Pacific Decadal Oscillation, PDO, which is a longer frequency, generally definitely multi-year, often decadal oscillation, but not consistent in its pattern. And then there's linear change, right? The progressive warming, so climate change, for example. And then these pulse perturbations, like the oil spill, like the heat wave that we recently experienced, which is identified here, showing the blob, the heat wave in the Northeast Pacific, that affected a large portion of the Gulf of Alaska, but also the Canada and the US West Coast. And then the El Nino signal, which is El Nino's an equatorial signal. It has implications for up here in Alaska too, but it originates at the equator. And the regime shift of the 1970s was well documented, but not fully identified and accepted until a decade or two afterwards. And so, but this was really part of the impetus for trying to understand the impact of the oil spill during a period of change that's already started to occur and was occurring in the Gulf of Alaska. And you can see this very nicely. These pictures show how the small mesh trawl survey around Kodiak, you see this transition from a shrimp fishery. So those of you who have been around here long enough remember a shrimp fishery in the Gulf of Alaska. I know my wife, who traveled with her family in the 70s to do their big adventure with a travel trailer and dirt roads traveling throughout Alaska. When we first moved to Anchorage and went down to Homer in 1995, she said, I remember shrimp boats at this tied up to the dock here, and I just thought, what shrimp boats? There are shrimp boats in the Gulf of Alaska. Well, there were, and she did see them, but they're gone. And as the ecosystem transitioned to a more predatory fish-dominated ecosystem by the 80s and 90s, as shown here. This graphic really nicely describes kind of all of the, summarizes the post-Exxon Valdez oil spill research that occurred up until 2014, looking at what species, of all the long list of species and habitats that were identified as injured, which ones have recovered, they're in green, which ones were recovering in yellow, and then which species and habitats were not recovering, and those are in red along the bottom. And this particular status has not been updated since 2014, but Gulf Watch Alaska started in 2012. So it was very timely to be able to look back at these species, and these species, many of these species, of course, and habitats were included in Gulf Watch Alaska, to better understand what was their recovery trajectory after 2014. Okay, so speaking of pulse perturbations, like the oil spill, there was the heat wave, the Northeast Pacific, the major marine heat wave that lasted almost a full 2 years. So this is unprecedented for heat wave monitoring globally. You'll hear of other heat waves down in Australia and elsewhere that their intensity was as high or higher than the one we experienced here, but none of those lasted as long. This one lasted almost 2 full years and continued through the winter, which is really critical in terms of how much of an effect it had. And as you saw in the news, and as you observed in person, there's no doubt that this mass mortality of marine birds. An example here showing skinny whales that where these mini populations suffered during the heat wave. Of course, some were positive too, but there were a lot of effects that were negative that affected the humans in the area and resources, commercial fisheries, etc., and subsistence harvests. The projection is that heat waves will become more prevalent. So it's critical that we understand what impacts and what this heat wave had and what the recovery potential is, and what that trajectory looks like. This is a graphic that nicely demonstrates some of these long-term monitoring time series that are included in Gulf Watch Alaska, but were part of other programs or just independent survey efforts before Gulf Watch Alaska and other integrated ecosystem studies. But it shows that, for example, the oceanographic station at the base of the Seward Line, Gulf of Alaska 1, just outside in Resurrection Bay, that monitoring there was started by oceanographers before the oil spill. It's over 50-year time series now. Some of the sea otters and herring research, of course, occurred prior to the oil spill and prior to the regime shift of 1978, 77, 78 in that area. Same is true for Middle Island, killer whales, marine birds, the Seward Oceanographic Line, Sprinkling Recorder. So these time series included these major changes in the Gulf of Alaska, the regime shift, the oil spill, and then now the heat wave, the block in the Northeast Pacific. But then we have this climate change intensification that we are observing now. And so we're able to observe and understand some of the complications that's creating for species and habitats. Right now we're funding through 2026. We're not sure what's going to happen beyond that. Our goal was to go at least to the 20 years would be in 2031. So we'll see. Hopefully we get funding for another 5 years, but there's uncertainty there. Okay, so how have things changed in the Gulf of Alaska over these time series? Here's the temperature profile for the upper one is the surface, upper 50 meters, and the bottom temperature, the lower 50 meters at the Gulf of Alaska 1, we got one station in Resurrection Day. And one thing that is very clear to see here is that our warm periods are more prevalent, and we're not seeing cold periods like there was back in the 70s. And also the other thing that's very evident is that this recent warm period after 2014-15, since the heat waves, has been the level of warming and the duration of the warming is unlike what's been seen before. And even though we're seeing some cooling, which is really positive, and we'll be reviewing some additional data in recent year, or from this current year. The cooling is certainly positive to see at the surface, but you're still seeing continual warming in the lower water column. Okay, so looking at our different components, the environmental drivers, the nearshore and the pelagic ecosystem, how did that, we looked at all of these time series that we've been collecting in a community-wide basis, and then tried to assess how did the heat wave affect these different ecosystems. So this is looking at the intertidal and looking at fitting these common trends through the time series. And as you can see, there are some time series that showed negative, declining responses, and others showed positive. So there's winners and losers within these different communities. But during the heat wave and up until at least 2018, it was primarily negative trends, especially in terms of, for example, the rockweed, the fucus on the shoreline. So the images on the right here show you that. 2013, you see this intertidal zone just covered with fucus, and then in 2019, that fucus, that rockweed is largely missing compared to what it used to be. But then you have in the intertidal zone, you have other species that are going to occupy that space, for example, barnacles and mussels, for example. So what's happened since? Well, one thing from our intertidal sampling, that includes the sampling areas in Cushman Sound, Kenai Fjords, Kachemak Bay, and then all the way out in Katmai. And you see these, prior to the heat wave, you saw these kind of independent local controls of patterns or variability, so more local variability. Well, once the heat wave hit, that was like a major signal and pulse perturbation that just affected all sites across the board in the Gulf of Alaska. And you can see that, for example, with the fucus at the top and the sea stars in the middle, that there was just declines across the board at all locations during the heat wave years. And then since then, but it's been a good 7, 8 years, you're starting to see this more return to local control. So you are seeing some recovery. It doesn't look exactly like it did pre-heat wave, but you're starting to see this variability among sites, which is an indication that they're returning to what the pre-heat wave conditions and controls were for those sites. For lower trophic levels of zooplankton, it's interesting that for the most part, when you look at the surface, when you look at some individual species, you see absolutely see differences, like more cold water associated species decline, more warm water associated species increase for individual species. But when you look at the community as a whole, when you look at size and warm water, cold water, for the most part, they increased. And that wasn't really expected. And that we've seen some very different patterns in the Bering Sea when we look at the zooplankton communities there, and also a little bit further out west in the Gulf of Alaska. So overall, the zooplankton community actually seemed to do quite well through the heat wave years. So what's happened since? This is just showing for the sewer line time series for the spring, May, and the fall, September sampling, and large copepods, large colony copepods, euphausids, and you see that post-heat wave, so after 2017, 18, 19, and 2020 on, there's actually some decline or average level abundances of these taxons of zooplankton. So you don't see the really strong heat wave signal at the lower trophic levels that you might expect. Okay, so how about moving up another trophic level to forage fishes? And again, we see these mixed trends where some species declined, especially capelin, herring, at least for a short period of time. And in salmon nets, there was more of an increase, which is not too unexpected because we often see in the Gulf of Alaska that during cold years, capelin are more successful and salmon nets less successful. So they kind of alternate. And this was some analysis done by Yumi Aramitsu, who's a Gulf Watch Alaska investigator, looking at the resilience of forage fish, so this kind of portfolio effect, like you would have with your, maybe managing your stocks for retirement, for example. And overall, you see during the heat wave year shown there in, with the dotted vertical lines, that the portfolio of forage declined, including the herring, sand lance, capelin, and then also krill too. But then it recovered fairly quickly post heat wave, at least from that analysis. But when you look at what some of the predators are consuming, so this is a seabird, this indicates black-legged kittiwakes. They also have rhinoceros auklet, a long time series out at Middleton Island, out on the outer shelf of the Gulf of Alaska, and showing their diets changing over time. And you see these periods of where, for example, in 1997 to 2006, in that range where sand lance was, in the darker blue, is kind of more of a dominant species. And you see other species show up. You see some capelin, more in some years than others, which are the lighter blue. And then you have this period when you have a cooling period in the Gulf of Alaska, 2008 to 2013, where you see capelin returning. And this was one of those periods in time where we were all getting pretty excited, like, okay, the Gulf of Alaska is returning to a cold period again, like maybe regime shift back in the 70s, where capelin's rebounding, we're getting more forage species, of course, and then the heat wave hits in 2014. And you see this decline of both the both the sand lance and the capelin. And you see an increase in other species like herring in the green there. And we're starting to see a little bit of return of sand lance in the dark blue as you get into 2018-19, which is kind of that portfolio effect of those species returning post heat wave. And then capelin, we don't see it start returning into 2023. And then 2024 is looking a little bit better. So when you look at individual species, you're saying, yes, we're seeing some recovery post heat wave. But when you look at the community of prey, the species diversity of prey as a whole, it is quite clear that since 2014, these birds have switched prey, and they're primarily getting by foraging on species in different proportions to what they did in previous years, except with some exceptions, like 1996, you see a similar pattern, but never for this prolonged period of time. So, we look at this and say, oh yeah, that's good, capelin is starting to return, but overall, the conditions are very different for these seabirds nesting out on Middleton Island and the prey resources they have to rely on. Okay, well, how about birds and mammals? So as you move up the food chain. Well, for the most part, we saw primarily negative trends. And the one positive trend that you see there on this graphic was primarily stellar sea lions in the west of Cook Inlet. And there's some indication that some of those individuals might have moved, and mostly not that the pups were all negative, but this was adult animals and subadults that non-pups that they think likely moved from kind of the central Gulf of Alaska region more to the west. And looking at a variety of time series over the length of the time series, at least up until 2018, so immediately after, following the post-heat wave, one thing that's quite clear is that you see these just dramatic step changes, just like you saw in the seabird diets, right? So the step changes were just unlike any prior years of the past couple decades that these time series existed. So again, up at the top, you see, well, zooplankton, it's interesting, it was actually more abundant than previous years as a whole. But the mid and upper trophic levels, the forage fish, the seabirds, the marine mammals, we see declines immediately post heat wave. during those for those species. And then this is using this long-term time series that the Fish and Wildlife Service, Data Irons, has curated and done these surveys, conducted these surveys since 1985. So this is a count of all kittiwake colonies in Prince William Sound. One count in the early season when you're counting nests, and one count late season when you're to count chicks. And this was just the data for the number of nests. And the division of north and south, this is from analysis we did back in 2001, I think we finished this analysis, looking at those colonies that have, and we divided it partly by diets. So those colonies that have more access to food resources in the Gulf of Alaska and Gulf of Alaska intrusion in Prince William Sound versus those that are further back up in the fjords. And one thing that we saw differently was that those ones that were in the north, more in the fjord colonies, were more dependent on herring, especially H1 herring. Whereas the ones further to the south had access to sand lance, which those in the north did, but to a lesser extent had to travel further to get it, more just energy expenditure to get to those prey resources. But then also these ones in the south had access to Capeland that were part of just from Gulf of Alaska intrusion into Prince William Sound. But you see these, one thing we saw, back then, over 20 years ago, was these disparate trends. A declining trend for those in the south, and an increasing trend for those in the north. But then, again, the heat wave effect. And you see this dramatic decline in both colony, attendance, nest building, both in the north and the south. And then since, there's been this recovery or, increasing trend, but at least for the south, they've kind of returned back to, approaching pre-heat wave, but not quite yet because they had sort of stabilized in the south, but certainly not in the north. So in these situations, the nest building for the kittiwakes in Prince William Sound have not returned to the pre-heat wave levels. And then this isn't part of Gulf Watch Alaska, but some analysis of stellar sea lion survival in the Gulf of Alaska. And this was done by Kelly Hastings with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And what this is, the take-home messages, there's a lot of graphs there, so you can mostly ignore those except for the lower left. The take-home message is that the survival of adult females was reduced in the marine heat wave across all areas. But it was the decline was most largest in Prince William Sound population and remained at a low level longer in Prince William Sound relative to Southeast Alaska and relative to the Kodiak Island area. So, for various reasons, it seems like the population or subpopulation in Prince William Sound was affected more by the heat wave. One of this legacy signature time series that was included in Gulf Watch Alaska is the killer whale monitoring that's occurred, most primarily between Resurrection Bay and Prince William Sound. And this is just here's an example, a photo on the right of the Exxon Valdez on Bly Reef and the AV pod surfacing just behind the tanker. The AT1 pod, which is a transient pod, it lost all reproductive females during the oil spill. So that group was on a long-term trajectory of it's not going to recover. But the AV pod, which lost quite a few individuals, almost over 10. That was on this long-term recovery trajectory post-oil spill. But then the heat wave hit, and that it essentially erased almost the full recovery, 30 years of recovery post-oil spill. So we're starting to see some return, with births in that group, but still, it's that, the AV pod has not returned to, post-heat wave levels. And in fact, it's down closer to post-oil spill levels. And this figure is showing in bars of humpback whales. The line is the herring abundance index for the miles of spawn in Prince William Sound. So again, the heat wave occurring 2014 through 16. We had another smaller one that I haven't really been talking about. 2019, it was mostly a summer event, but not a winter event, not an all-year heat wave, but it certainly had impacts too. But the humpback whale population in Prince William Sound has not returned to pre-heat wave levels, even though the herring, at least the spawning abundance, has returned, closer to pre-heat wave levels. The humpback whales are just slow to recover. 2024 is looking a little more promising. The numbers are still low, but the number of calves has increased at a level that we have not seen since pre-heat wave. So that's a real, it's positive to see, but still the numbers are low. And the humpback whales are a really interesting story overall for not just Prince William Sound, but also the Gulf of Alaska. So the part of the way that the whale biologists track populations is with the fluke IDs, right? So they can identify individuals. So this is an analysis of the time series from Glacier Bay. And Glacier Bay has this really long and annual monitoring of humpback whales. It's one of the amazing uses of head taxes from the cruise ships that go into Prince William Sound, that they've been able to maintain this humpback whale group of biologists to track populations. And so this is looking at the population trends over time, the heat wave there in yellow, and then also in black calves, juveniles, adults, for the different age classes. And you'll see overall population declines post heat wave, but also you see very few calves. So in those heat wave years, and not until 2020, you start seeing more calves. And then 2024, they've seen more calves than any previous years post heat wave. So finally, there's enough food out there to increase the condition of females to be able to get pregnant and raise their young. One really neat analysis that's been done with the humpback whale data is through this fluke ID effort through Happy Whale. So essentially, it's all of the scientists studying the humpback whales, photo ID. They used to spend hours, if not days, looking through photo books to try to identify individual whales if they didn't know them by sight, which many whales are identified by sight instantly. But Happy Whale, a lot of what Gulf Watch Alaska and other humpback whale investigators did is they took all these known identified whales, fluke IDs, and they worked with Chet Cheeseman, who created essentially artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms to identify humpback whales with these training data sets that the researchers have built over all these years. And so now you can, even on your phone, use Happy Whale to identify a whale as soon as you take the picture and get a sighting record of that whale. And so they used that power to be able to do a population estimate for humpback whales in all of the North Pacific. So in that smaller figure inset, it's hard to see, but primarily the take-home message there is you see this not even close to rapid, but this long-term increase, a major increase in abundance post-commercial wading, right? The recovery of humpback whales in the North Pacific. And then you get to the 2014 to 16 heat wave, and post-heat wave, you see this decline. And so in some cases, when it was initially being discussed, it was like, well, this population's increasing, it finally reached carrying capacity, and then you're just seeing this adjustment. It's just classic biological, ecosystem carrying capacity theory. But I would argue that overly simplifies what happened. What happened is that the carrying capacity changed. So that population is increasing, and it didn't hit this, this kind of theoretical maximum and just was oscillating below that. That maximum declined. That carrying capacity declined, and you see that with this rapid decline of humpback whales. And so that's what the larger figure is showing, kind of zoomed in, this decline, and this is for the North Pacific as a whole. But there's some spatial patterns that are very different. So for example, on the lower left there, it shows all the matches from happy whales of fluke IDs throughout the Pacific Rim with the calving areas in Hawaii, over in Japan, in the Ogasawara Islands, and then also on in the Eastern Pacific off Mexico, down off of Baja Peninsula, where there's also calving locations there too. And when you break up the two kind of migratory groups, so the group that migrates to Hawaii, the group that migrates to Mexico, you see very different trends through the heat wave. The ones that were migrating to Mexico, there isn't the heat waves impact, the heat wave decline that you see as the ones migrating to Hawaii. And the majority of humpback whales that are here in the Gulf of Alaska from Suryan Sound, they migrate to Hawaii, not Mexico, surprisingly. Actually, there's some more of the individuals out in the Aleutian Islands migrate to Mexico rather than Hawaii. But this analysis also showed that as a population as a whole, the decline was about 20%. So the estimated loss of whales is around 6,000 to 7,000 whales. And it's mostly from this Hawaiian migration group. And it's uncertain why that's the case. Kind of one of the leading hypotheses, or at least one hypothesis, is that those individuals migrating to Mexico are following these coastal regions where there's foraging opportunities. In fact, there's recent publications of humpback whales on the breeding grounds down in Mexico feeding down there. Whereas, the kind of classic humpback whales story is that they bulk up in Alaska, they migrate, and you don't feed until they return to Alaska again. Well, that's not the case for Mexico. And those migrate along the West Coast. In Hawaii, that's more likely the case, right? They have to migrate across these, low productivity oceans, these oligotrophic waters down to Hawaii where there's little foraging opportunity. So they have to be especially in good condition to survive that long migration. And that's a potential explanation for why you see this greater effect on the Hawaiian population. This is showing, we have a variety of surveys that are looking at marine bird abundance. This is for the summer surveys in Prince William Sound, and two species that are listed as, or taxon that are listed as still not recovered from the post-oil spill. And you can see that, over the long term, the population has declined. They seem to have reached some sort of steady state before the 2014, and then they declined for murrelets and pitching guillemots. And they haven't recovered to pre-heat wave, to 2014 levels yet in this data set. We see different patterns in other data sets, which shows probably some different spatial variability. But when you look at all the species as a whole that's tracked by this survey, and the fact that over the long term you see 9 taxa with decreasing trends and 0 with increasing trends, that's concerning. The positive side, at least for pigeon guillemots, and this is a busy graph, but let me walk you through the line. So this is at the naked island complex. This was a separate study, not part of GofA Alaska, but a separate project funded by the Exxon Valdez Trustee Council. The red line in the bottom is, along the years, is mink at Naked Island. The mink were removed. They go down to 0. The blue dots are the number of nests at Naked Island, Naked Peak and Story, that Naked Island group. So the number of nests start increasing as the number of mink go down. The black line is a survey of pigeon guillemots around that Naked Island group, and they're increasing. So that previous graph I showed you, pigeon guillemots throughout the Sound wide were declining, but here in the Naked Island group, they're increasing. And then the orange line is just showing a control group of Seal Island, Smith Island, just to show that indeed the mink eradication on Naked Island, which they spent quite a bit of time determining that they were introduced, so those were removed, and that provided certainly some habitat restoration and benefit to the pigeon guillemot colony there on Naked Island. One of the things we're trying to do is integrate all the data sets from Prince William Sound and other parts of the Gulf of Alaska, so our Gulf Watch Alaska monitoring. This is just create the food web, showing this is from an ecopath mass balance model of Prince William Sound, showing all the different end members, components, etc., and the complexity of just nature, the food web of Prince William Sound. This is more of a diagram summarizing that ecopath energy flow within Prince William Sound, showing 2 years before the heat wave and during the heat wave, so 2010, 2016. And this is just showing the energy flow to the different trophic levels on the right. Copepods, zooplankton, low levels, and then killer whales at the trophic levels. And really the take-home message here is what is kind of describing what you saw in all these previous figures, is that between these 2 years, and we've included more years and multiple heat wave events, during the heat waves and even with multiple heat wave events, what you end up seeing is that you get as much energy going to lower trophic levels, showing copepods up there too. But when you look down at the upper trophic levels, you see that the thickness of the lines, the blue bars are much thicker than the orange bars. And the orange bars are thinner in more recent years. So what that's showing you is that less energy is going to these mid and upper trophic level species. And we're seeing that in the data too, right? And so the idea of creating a model that reflects what our observations are showing us is a way for us to try to understand some of the mechanisms behind these changes that we're seeing. Okay, so going back to that figure, in 2014, and revisiting what those individual species or taxa are doing. And this isn't exhaustive, but it's just some examples. So what I've added here now is from our long-term monitoring. After 2014, when this figure was originally completed, what is the trend after the heat wave? And so in green are those species or groups that have increased. Yellow is those that have declined and then returned close enough to pre-heat wave levels. And then red is where they declined and did not return. And you can see that there are, for those species that were recovering, the post-heat wave, they actually saw some improvements in clams. For example, black oyster catchers, mussels. Mussels increased as the rockweed declined, and oyster catchers took advantage of that. And the same is true for Barrow's goldknot that are feeding on the mussels and others, right? But for the AV pod, it was their situation became worse after the heat waves in terms of recovery. Herring looked to have recovered to at least pre-heat wave levels, but maybe we'll see. It'll be really interesting in these upcoming years to see if they progress beyond that kind of long-term steady state that they were in before the heat wave. Pigeon guillemots decline sound wide, but there's the exception I showed for Naked Island. And then Kittleses, murrelets, and Norway murrelets, at least from the sound-wide data set, show a long-term decline. And more importantly, this decline post-heat wave and not recovery to pre-heat wave levels. So these are some of the main items that we're focusing on during our discussions, and also trying to understand, what does the future hold for Prince William Sound, the Gulf of Alaska, and these injured resources.
Hey, Rob.
Yeah.
So, like a killer whale has a calf every 3 years.
Uh-huh.
Black oyster catcher might have 4 chicks in a year, right?
Yeah.
So how do you judge decline not returned when you have a very long-lived versus, a very slow reproducing versus a very fast reproducing animal? Can you truly say it's not on the same recovery path? How do you weight it for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the statement is more that not that the killer whales should have recovered already, but that they haven't. And I think the life history factors into that. Like the projected recovery of killer whales is exactly what you're stating. It's going to be much longer than oyster catchers, for example, and golden eyes too, and any of these other species too. But for example, with pigeon guillemot, you'd have to do an individual population model to understand it. They should have recovered by then. But humpback whales are in the same situation, like you say, with killer whales. I think the whale biologists were talking recently that it's generally about 2 years of good feeding to then have a calf. So you have enough food to be in good enough condition to conceive, and then and then once after parturition to be able to feed that calf. Their estimate is like 2 good years of feeding to produce a calf. But then humpback whales, when the feeding conditions are good, and I don't know about killer whales, but when the feeding conditions are good, there are females that produce a calf every year. But that's only when conditions are good for them. But even so, like with humpback whales, right now, 2024 is the year that we finally see this return of more calves again. So that's even, I guess it's even longer than we would have expected, right? But yeah, that's an important question and something that we still need to tackle. Yeah, and that's all I have. But to end on this quote that our program leader, Mandy Lindenberg, who many of you I'm sure know, is that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And I think that's critically important for these long-term monitoring programs, that we include monitoring and research, because you can measure one thing for decades, but it takes dedicated research and analysis to make sure you're still measuring the right things and still counting the right things into the future. That's it. Thanks very much. Happy to answer any questions if there are any.
I got one on the, like the copepods at lower trophic level may be higher. Is the chicken or the egg, are they higher because there's less predators, or are they higher because it's good? You know what I'm asking? Like, it might be that we've knocked out these big things, so the copepods are doing better. Or there might be something else.
Yes. Yeah, actually I think that's exactly what, at least initially, that's what the thought was. And in fact, there was a publication by Sonia Batten, who, that's one thing exactly what she proposed, is that it's kind of this predator release, right? Like the abundance of zooplankton was higher because there were fewer predators grazing zooplankton. Yeah.
So do we know the answer, or we're still looking at that?
I don't think we'll ever definitively be able to say yes or no, but I think it is accurate to say that was part of it. Yeah.
Okay.
But then the other part of it, I think, yeah, it gets more complicated after that, but like, for example, when you get into more foraging theory too, right? Where if there's still some large copepod species that are more lipid rich, if they're still available, but then your prey field is clouded with all these, or just, just clouded with all these smaller species that are less lipid rich, how much time does the predator take to work its way through and find the more lipid rich prey items? They can be selective, but maybe in some situations they can't. That's also another one we'll probably never be able to answer. But yeah, that's certainly part of it initially. And I think that speaks to both, during the heat wave, there was bottom-up effects from productivity, but also top-down too. And so the loss of the mid-trophic level, the forage fish, part of that, the idea behind their decline was not only just favorable reproductive conditions for them, or less favorable, but also that as the water warms, fish, especially predatory fish like cod, halibut, etc., their metabolism increases, right? They're not homeothermic, right? So as their bodies warm, their metabolism increases, they have to eat more. So John Pike called this ectothermic vice. So as the water warmed, there was lower quality prey for the forage fish, and there were predators that needed to consume more. So it gets at exactly what you were describing. All right, well, thanks very much for coming out.
Is that whale thing called happy whale?
Happy whale, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and online. Yeah, so you
I'm
can,
gonna tell people about it.
you should, it's